Good afternoon or good morning, folks, depending upon where you're calling in from. Want to just say thanks for joining us on a Monday morning slash afternoon, especially if you're on your lunch hour. But want to just say thank you and welcome to another installment of the Conservative Energy Network's Empowering Tomorrow webinar series. I'm Bradley Pischea, and I serve as the National Director for the Conservative Energy Network's Land and Liberty Coalition. Within this network, we work on a lot of grassroots and grass tops issues around community engagement for renewable energy projects across a 13-state footprint. And as we all know, I think community engagement, or community opposition, I should say, remains to be one of the primary inhibiting factors preventing new clean energy projects from coming online across the country. And today with our panelists, we're going to talk about how earnest local engagement can help ensure that these projects are seen as a win by local decision makers and their host communities alike. And with us today, I'm really excited to have Bevan Augustine from Evergreen Stakeholder Engagement, Jackson Keith with Steelhead Americas, and Montana Burgess from Mountaintop Strategies. So starting with Bevan, then Montana, then Jackson, would love for each of you just to say a quick word about who you are and why you're here, and then would love to jump into some questions for the next hour. So thanks again for the three of you being here with us today and for everybody else who's participating in the panel. So thank you so much.
Really appreciate you inviting me to be on this panel today. I'm Bevan Augustine. I'm calling in from Oregon, where I live with my wife and 3.5-year-old son and 9-month-old daughter. I actually got a good night of sleep last night, so I'm feeling pretty good and really happy to be here. I've been working in renewables for about a decade now. Was most recently Senior Director of Community Engagement at RWE Clean Energy, where I helped build out their community engagement team from the ground up. I left RWE in July, and since July, I've been working with folks in the clean energy sector, really helping them implement the types of strategies that we're going to be talking about today. So really excited for this conversation.
Hello, everybody. My name is Montana Burgess. I'm actually based in Canada, in British Columbia. And I, for the last decade, ran an organization called Neighbors United here that did a lot of community organizing around energy policy in rural and small and suburban communities. And we had a lot of wins, and we piloted something called deep canvassing, which is a methodology that results in people changing their hearts and minds on an issue through a long-form conversation. And since leaving that organization in the spring, I now am consulting with my own consultancy, Mountaintop Strategies, and I'm working with a bunch of groups in the Midwest around renewable energy siting.
And I am Jackson Keith. I am the Director of Public Engagement at Steelhead Americas, which is a Vestas company. Previously, before this, I've got about a decade of experience in this space as well, and was working with my friend Bradley here at the Land and Liberty Coalition. And I'm scrolling through the attendee list and I see many familiar names. So it's great to be here talking about all these great things that we enjoy, and kind of excited to get into it. So thank you, Bradley. Happy to be here.
Thanks, folks. Well, let's dive right in. First, got a question for you, Bevan. How early should community engagement start in earnest, and what can you do, even though you're operating as an outsider, doing your best to feel part of the community and work in partnership with them?
Thanks, Bradley. That's a great question, and I think something that is surprisingly more controversial than you'd imagine. I'm going to start with a quote from Scott Lasser from the Rural Climate Partnership. He likes to say that if you've been to one rural community, you've been to one rural community, which I think really underscores just how every single community is different. So it's hard to sort of provide like a generic catch-all. But with that in mind, I think before you even go and step foot into a community, when you're sort of first looking at areas of interest and starting to think about signing land, there's a ton that you can learn about those communities through desktop research and frankly through conversations with some of the groups like Land and Liberty Coalition or other advocacy groups that are working across the country and often have a lot of helpful knowledge about these communities. So, understanding their culture, their history, kind of what their economy looks like, understanding decision makers if they've ever had experience with renewable energy projects in the past. There's a ton you can learn. like I said, before you ever go in. And it's really helpful to know how the community that you're developing in is different than maybe some of the other communities that you've had experience with. Um, but I'd say, frankly, the earlier the better, right? You always hear community engagement needs to happen early and consistently throughout a project's life cycle. So as soon as you're thinking about signing land, once you start sending out letters of interest, once you start talking to landowners, especially some of the folks that have been in industry for a long time, there's been a history of maybe laying low until you get full site control before you go and talk to the county about a project. But the community knows about that project and they've known about it for a really long time in most cases. And so, my recommendation is as soon as you're starting to show up, like I said, mailing out letters to landowners, having some of those conversations. Leases get filed at the county, so the county knows. I'd highly recommend you meet with county officials, let them know about a project, let them understand what the development process looks like, that it's a multi-year effort. Have some of those preliminary conversations, start building trust. You're going to hear, I think, a recurring theme throughout what I say today about spending time in those communities, connecting with people and building relationships. And I think the earlier you do that, especially with decision makers, the better it is for the project.
Thanks, Bevan. And a quick follow-up to that is, do you find it's challenging to balance some of the proprietary needs as a developer with sort of winning over that trust and being a good community partner?
I mean, I think there's always some tension. You don't want to necessarily start, broadcasting all over the place that this is an area that you're interested in. But again, people know the idea of, flying under the radar and nobody like realizing that a bunch of leases are getting signed by some company, it just doesn't really fly. So I think, there is a need to balance some of that proprietary information. And frankly, I'd recommend, again, this sort of targeted one-on-one outreach. You're not holding, open public meetings. You're not running ads necessarily or putting up billboards, but you can meet with people individually who are likely going to know about the project anyways, and start to build that trust. The other thing I'd say is that, as soon as a company, gets in files for interconnection, they're in the queue and that's all public information. So again, oftentimes people know before companies start, doing some of this outreach and meeting with key stakeholders in the communities. I mentioned county officials. I'd say, chambers of commerce, economic development corporations. You don't necessarily want to meet with everybody super early, but meeting with some of those key folks, the earlier the better.
Thanks, Bevan. And a couple things, I've seen a couple of Q&As come through, so keep those coming and we'll get to those either as we come along or towards the end of the panel. But in a similar vein, Jackson, this question's for you. It was, how do you balance meeting regulatory requirements with going above and beyond to build strong local relationships?
Yeah. Thanks, Brad, and appreciate everything Bevan was saying there as well. I think this is a really interesting topic, and as regulatory requirements continue to morph, I guess you could say, I think this puts our space more in the limelight. But I think it's interesting because this space, public engagement, public acceptance, stakeholder management, kind of exists outside of the regulatory confines. Like when you think about permitting, there's obviously a lot to do there, and I think there's a lot of boxes to check. But what we're thinking about in the way that we've kind of structured things is really how do you create a political goodwill to support this project? A lot of these decisions, whether they be at the county level, the state level, or in the hands of a governor, are political decisions. And so I think what we're really trying to do is lean into trusted messengers, some of the framework that Bevan just talked about there, and having local liaisons in these communities, having landowners that can speak up and talk about these projects, and really trying to come at it from the perspective of a community-led effort and not an individual developer who's coming in and saying, hey, this project is good for XYZ reason. We want people backing that up. And I think that part of the regulatory requirements are included in there because you want to have people who are speaking to the decision makers, whether it, again, be local, state, or even at a federal level in some regard. So that's how I think we're balancing it. And I really think that trust is the most important. And it does seem a little cliche, but it is so critical right now to have somebody on the ground that you can trust both as a developer and that the community trusts to drive these efforts forward over the course of the next 3 to 6 years.
Jackson, does that look like having somebody on your team who's a trusted local messenger, or finding local advocates and champions that are within the community that don't have a direct stake in the project, or some combination of both?
I think there's both. I mean, look, there's a really great organization called the Land and Liberty Coalition that does the former there and tries to find people who don't have a direct stake in the project to speak up and support the benefits of it. But it's also somebody on your land team that's trusted, somebody who could go and sit at these kitchen tables and is a voice in the community that people recognize. We have a couple instances right now where we have somebody who's helping us out on our project and sharing things to Facebook. And you can see even the opposition who's not aligned with this project and is actively working to fight it is like, Eddie, you're a good guy. This is a cool project. We'll come out, we'll listen to this. So having somebody like that in the area that's trusted and can make Facebook posts and have that reach within the community that can start to dismantle some of the opposition threat is a very helpful thing in both the land campaign and as you move towards these more regulatory requirements like permitting.
For sure. And that's one of the main advantages the opposition has, is that they're ever present. They're members of the community. And so finding a way to inoculate that by having our own members of the community be supportive makes a huge difference. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Montana, question for you. What does community engagement, what role does it play in the success or failure of a project more broadly?
Yeah, I think the angle I'm coming from this at is from having conversations with residents on the ground over the last 2 years in Ohio, in Indiana, in Michigan, with the folks at Land and Liberty, um, in Nebraska, and conversations with people at the door, people that are opposed, people that are undecided. The thing that comes up over and over is folks care about their communities. They don't like change, and they have self-interest that we have to figure out how to enter into conversation and enter into a place of finding common ground around that self-interest. And I think the reality is community engagement is key to making it work or not. And so when developers are coming in and they think it makes sense to do a project in an area, I think thinking about what is the self-interest, both of the electeds, which has been spoken about a little bit already, but also about those key community members, which has also been spoken about and what Jackson just kind of shared, but then also the average people in the community. What do they care about? What are their needs? What are their barriers? And those people that we've talked to a lot in all this work over the last couple of years, and specifically in Michigan and the work that I'm doing with Land and Liberty, is we hear over and over again that they know a lot about the issue. They're actually not uninformed. A lot of their information is actually misinformation, but they know a lot. They have informed opinions. And they can share and they can imagine what the local impacts are going to be. And they can imagine what potentially is going to happen. And they don't want that change. They don't want to look out their door and see a community that doesn't look and feel rural anymore. So this is a big barrier to overcome. And I think, one thing developers can do is they can come into relationship with groups like Jackson said, Land and Liberty, who are able to engage in the community, or other community groups that are connected in a deep way to the community. And I think overall, what we need to be trying to do is divorcing these people that have this misinformation about these projects. And we need to divorce them from it using their lived experience and helping them understand what their self-interest is and how it can change things in a better way. And leveraging some of their shared values, their conservative values, to meet them where they're at and make a case for what they need in a way that appeals to their emotional lived experience, and not just present them with counterfacts, right? Because when we get counterfacts, it just gets us defensive, frankly, if we don't already believe them. So we need to really get to that lived emotional experience. And I think when we do that in a scaled way in a community, it can create this long-term impact that can bring people into relationship with each other, which allows things to move forward in a continued way and not just stop and end with one moment.
It's really interesting, Montana. It sounds like the way to have those conversations, and at least our experience has been with you, it's very labor intensive and very time intensive. So the challenge might be doing that at scale. And if you can't do that at scale, how can we overcome that issue?
Yeah, such a great, complicated question. I think you have to figure out, where people are in the community. What are the kind of constituency bases? How many people are already supportive? And you just need to find them and help them show their support and get them together. Those landowners that want it, how can we create homes for them so they can support each other? And when they feel like they can't speak up because the opposition's loud, how can we help them be a team and speak up together? Who are the people that are undecided? How many of them do we actually need to reach to make an impact? That's where, you can really focus in with those kind of more intensive conversation methodologies like deep canvassing. Likewise with the opposition, how many of them do we actually need to reach and attempt to neutralize? Or is there so few we don't need to worry about it? So I think it's about making a strategic calculus of where your people are. And then I think the thing we can do from these long conversations is we can learn what's beyond the surface for people. Polling often just gets people's reactions and doesn't dig deep into those like emotional lived experiences, which shape how we make decisions and how we do things like vote or show up in our communities. So I think these kind of long conversations can inform the messages we put out at a bigger scale beyond what polling can teach us and help amplify and reinforce some of those changes we're making through individual conversations.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think, to your point, a lot of the traditional means of reaching folks might be able to do that in large swaths, but they're not as durable as what we've seen with some of the deep canvassing conversations. And so it's almost more of a quantity versus quality situation. And that's not to say that you shouldn't do the traditional means as well, reach as many folks as you can, but surely a lot of the more durable relationships that we build are very impactful. So Bevan, one of the points that Montana just made is really interesting about the sort of the relationship with information that a lot of these folks in these communities have. So who and how do we address some of those issues and sharing technical pieces of information on these projects, whether they be concerns over land use, health, public safety, things along those lines?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go back to my theme. I think spending time in the communities is absolutely critical to building trust and being able to convey some of this more technical information in a way that is going to be accepted. I think I'm going to, really reiterate and underscore some of what Montana was saying. We often have a tendency, I think we've all been drinking the Kool-Aid. We believe really strongly in the benefits that our projects provide. And so you get really excited. I've been in this situation where somebody asks you this question, you're like, oh, I got such a good answer. And you have a really strong talking point, or you can, describe a study. Oh, turbines don't kill that many birds. In fact, did you know that cats are the number one, whatever the case may be. But before you jump into that, it's really important to spend a lot of time and to listen, to try to really get to what that root concern is. At the end of the day, our projects, utility scale wind and solar projects, BESS projects, they are big changes in these communities. And people are understandably concerned and want to, get to the bottom of what this change is going to be and make sure, again, that it doesn't have a negative impact. I think Montana's point around self-interest, you want to understand what that self-interest is, what those root concerns are, and then adapt your response or your messaging accordingly so that you're really addressing that. And if you are going to convey private property rights, health concerns, that you're coming at it from the same place that they are coming at those concerns from. So listen, spend time in the community so you can try to build some of that trust. And then I'd also just, say that as much as we hate to admit it, on the development side, we're not the most trusted messengers on these issues. Folks understand that developers have their own self-interest. They want to see a project get built. We're often coming in from outside of the community. And so I love hiring local liaisons, having people from the community that work on behalf of the team, but also looking for some of these third-party experts or other groups that can come in and talk more authentically incredibly about some of these issues. Private property rights, a developer talking about that is one thing. I think having Land and Liberty Coalition or an agricultural organization talking about the importance of letting farmers, develop their land and diversify their farming income is super important. So I guess to kind of recap, spend time with the community, listening before you respond and provide an answer, and then really leaning on some of these third-party groups to help bring more credibility into the conversations.
Thanks, Bevan. And in my experience, there are certainly times often where you hear concerns that are rooted in some sort of fact that folks have heard, whether there's merit to it or not. But ultimately, they're really just hanging their hat on, what Montana said is they don't want to see the fabric of their community change. And so to use a Montana quote, is it really helpful to be lost in fact land with these folks and go tit for tat with them on their concerns? Or is it best to try to make different sort of maybe even more ideological arguments to support these projects as opposed to getting super technical with folks who may not even really care about the issue that they're ostensibly hanging their hat on in the first place?
For me?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely don't think you want to ever get into a tit for tat with facts. And the thing is again, folks can find information to back up just about any argument they want to make, especially when it comes to renewables projects. So, it goes back to trying to find those shared values. And, oftentimes, especially when you're engaging folks that are, already organized and opposed to a project, if you can walk away from that conversation, not necessarily convincing them, but walking away, having built some respect, having them feel like you heard their concerns, that you understand where they're coming from. I actually think that that's a really big win. And again, this gets to, I think, the importance of time and community and having these conversations is that it's very easy for an outside developer to be sort of painted as this big kind of corporate boogeyman. And to just, leave a conversation with folks that don't want to see your project built, understanding that you're a real person that shares a lot of their same values, and to start to build some of that respect, even if you don't necessarily get their full support of a project, I think it's a really big win. So yeah, definitely avoid that tit for tat kind of technical. And I would also just say that often comes across extremely condescending. And again, having made some of these mistakes in my career, talking about a peer-reviewed study and throwing out a bunch of facts to somebody just doesn't, it never really goes over well. And I think the focus of those conversations has to be on building respect and trust and relationships instead of actually convincing.
Absolutely. I think the human element of it all cannot be understated. So I appreciate that. So question for you, Jackson, particularly as the resident developer on the panel. What are some developer specific things that can be done to ensure there are lasting positive relationships with local policymakers?
Yeah, and I'm smiling because you just mentioned the human element of this, which is just a fantastic segue into what I'm about to say. But coming up from political organizing in the advocacy space, I was always told that there's the individual decision maker, and then there's a network of people around that decision maker of where they're getting their information from. And you're supposed to work to influence, all aspects of that. Last week, we had an offsite with just our developers and our public engagement team at Steelhead, and a member of my team actually presented on a psychological theory called the systems theory, which explains that people are products of a complex interconnected system rather than individuals who act in isolation. In this graphic here on my screen that nobody can see, so this is bad webinaring, but you've got the individual in the middle, then you've got school, work, family, neighbors, etc., kind of right outside of that. Beyond that, you have friends, extended family, mass media, local governments, social norms, economic systems, etc. And so I really think that the way to build lasting support for clean energy projects is to influence this systems theory, to try to work through multiple different layers of this complex system to try to influence and build trusted relationships with decision makers. And I'll give you an example. Last week, we opened up an office at one of our Indiana projects, and we were talking with the auditor. who was saying that the amount of other government staff members who have called her office to see what the impacts of the first 1,000 megawatts of wind and all of the clean energy that's been built in this individual county is staggering. It's almost somebody from every county across the state who's interested in this. And so you know that there is an interest in what we're trying to deploy here and trying to build those connections. It's just how to actually work through this systems theory to build trust and influence folks to create, as you say, this lasting support for clean energy projects and policies. And that goes local level, state level, federal level.
It's a really interesting point. And from your experience, both working in the political world, but then also spending as much time as you have in the clean energy and renewable energy space, do you find that you're constantly fighting sort of two narratives, or there's a national discourse around clean energy, but then there's also local specific concerns? Do you see those as two divergent issues that you've got to tackle individually, or are they part of the same beast?
It's an interesting question. I think it's a part of both. I think there are very unique elements to every community we go in. And I think what Bevan referenced at the very start of this from Scott Lassner, if you've been in one rural community, you've been in one rural community, right? So that's very much true, but it's also not lost on me what the national narrative has done to this systems theory and the way people think about things and how they perceive information. So I think they are in kind of one thing. But I think there's different ways to approach that and break it down.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
And Montana, moving over, I think in a very similar vein, what can organizations do that maybe aren't the developer that are helping to support some of this work do to ensure that there is durable support for a project amongst local policymakers and residents, both before, during, and even after a project is constructed? And why is that important, particularly the after?
Yeah, I think this is like the fundamental question where we aren't nailing it particularly. And I think the very short answer is we need to be investing in relationships, real relationships with real people, real humans on the ground in all these places. And it's not a quick thing, it's not an easy thing. It takes starting as soon as you can and being genuine, telling stories that lead to relationship building and trust. And then once you have those relationships, you can organize them to be powerful and to show that power at different times when it's needed, like in the lead up to a decision point where an ordinance is being discussed or a specific project is being approved. But we've seen over and over a project or can be approved or an ordinance can be passed and then like things can roll back, right? Especially around ordinances. So I think it's really important if we do that good relationship building up front and during, then we continue to organize it after and help the community keep showing up for their self-interest. And I think the other unpopular opinion is we need to invest in offline relationships. You can translate that back online and transition them on and offline, but to cut through the noise in social media and the digital ecosystem, the best way to do that is through like face-to-face stuff in the community. You can trust that, you can trust that. So yeah, I think we need to invest in our relationships as early as possible, make them real relationships, have those relationships not just be with like the developer and the residents or, the community group and the residents, but with the residents with each other. Like I was saying before about landowners supporting each other and being connected as a team. And I think, yeah, there's nothing wrong with wanting to run this as a business and make money as developers, but we have to ground it in that long-term mission-driven field so we can have a longer story that goes on beyond a specific project, and those stories will build on each other and help these things continue to go forward, not just in one community, but others as well.
Maybe this might be a more elementary sort of follow-up, but walk through the differences and the importance of those in-person versus online relationships. I mean, what is the appropriate time for one versus the other? And not demonizing either of them, but sort of the distinction between the two.
Well, that's a good question. the online relationships, you can use online spaces to identify people that are supportive or are unsupportive or undecided. Like someone else said, you can get someone to put a Facebook post up and you see who engages with it in the community, and it gives you a sense of who's out there. And then an offline strategy would be, okay, like we've seen John Smith, who's supportive, engage with this post. So let's go talk, like DM John Smith and ask him if we can have coffee and talk to him and understand him better and understand, like Jackson was saying, who his network of influence is and how we can help him communicate with those people to build relationships around this particular issue and leverage the trust he already has. And he's just like a random guy in the community. We don't need to always be going to like the chamber president. We can go to them too. That's great. But let's also make sure we're finding those people that are raising their hands online and trying to engage with them offline. Likewise, you go out to a community event and you find people in the community who care about the issue or undecided or opposed, and then you can invite them to continue engaging online. And it can be a transition back and forth. I think the main thing, though, is what we've seen over the last 15 years is a transition to digital only strategies. And I think we're seeing the decay that's happening, that's happened from that in these like very real community fights. So to cut through some of that, we can't skip the offline anymore, I think.
I'd love to just add to that a little bit. No one's really going to start sharing a bunch of information well, I can't say nobody, but relatively few people are going to respond to a digital ad, suddenly hear from a developer that they've never met or heard from before, and then start sharing all this positive information with their community, and then show up to a public meeting and advocate in support of a project. People tend to get motivated to take action because of the relationships that they built, whether it's with the developer directly or, to Montana's point, within sort of a broader community of supporters. So, at RWE, when I was hiring folks for our community engagement team, I would always prioritize people with grassroots organizing experience because they have that experience actually, with very little budget and, basically going into communities, building a smaller community within potential advocates, and then sort of, helping them show their power and go out and take action because of all those relationships that they built. So again, it sounds a little bit warm and fuzzy saying, relationships, but it really is the only way to not just build trust in those communities, but to motivate and inspire people to actually go and take some action.
That's absolutely right. Again, there's no replacement for the human element. I think that's another recurring theme of the conversation today. So, question for each of you, and jump in as you'd like to. But as the clean energy development across the United States continues to scale up, I mean, even with challenges that we're seeing, what are some maybe broad strokes, commentaries, or things that you would like to see being done better as we are trying to do our best to engage with some of these communities and build support?
Jump into that one. I mean, I think I'll just note a big positive. When I started working in renewables about a decade ago, I was brought on a communications team and I was basically supporting a national portfolio of projects. And it was, the idea was, hey, we need some help with communications. And I think in the last decade, it's become really clear. And I got to kind of give the industry and folks in just general clean energy advocacy space, there's just been a lot more focus on the importance of community engagement within rural communities. So most companies now have started to build out community engagement teams. I think a lot of organizations that used to advocate, at the federal or state levels for renewable energy policy they're starting to understand that where the real challenges are actually down at that local level. And if you don't have support at the local level, that bubbles up into, challenges at the state and the federal level. So I do just want to, kind of give a shout out for the investment and the fact that folks are starting to recognize that, local engagement and getting community acceptance is really important for the industry and the overall energy transition. That said, I think there's still a lot of investment that needs to be made, while companies are starting to build out these community engagement teams, I don't know if they really understand how much time and effort it takes to do this work effectively. I think you often see people, community engagement practitioners supporting 10, 15 plus different projects. You can only be in one place at a time, and you're not able to, when you have that many projects kind of in your portfolio, you're not able to spend the time to really build these relationships and that trust that we've been talking about on this call. So I think good news, but still quite a bit of room for improvement. And I would just say too, it's some of this is like a culture. So, you might have a community engagement team, but it takes everybody in a company, and there's only a handful of companies that I've really seen do this successfully, where they build a culture of, whether it's their developers, their environmental permitting staff, their engineers, their ops staff, that everybody sort of has a role to play in, representing the company and trying to spend time actually doing some of this engagement. And so I think that there's a lot of room for improvement there.
Other
Um,
thoughts? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jackson.
I don't think this will surprise anyone coming from me, but I think in terms of investment and scaling things up, I still think we're behind the eight ball in terms of political engagement, both at the local, state, and federal level. I That's not to say that there's not some really smart people working on this, but I think in terms of investment and how we rack and stack against some of the other associations out there, um, more in that space, I think would go a long way. And county commissioners are up every 4 years. State reps are up every 2 years. Some state senates are up 2, 4, 6 years. And so there's a lot of opportunity across the 50 states for our industry and individual developers to play a larger role in the political engagement space. I do know that there's some significant restrictions on this, and I think folks like the American Energy Action and ACPs, ARM, as well as the regional organizations are doing some more in this space. But I think, as Bevan mentions, when you have opposition at the local level, it also can bubble up to the state level. And I think we've seen that in a number of different states. And that is a different fight than the county ordinance discussion, which requires different strategies. And I believe political engagement is one of those to double click on.
Yeah, it's certainly one that I think makes folks uncomfortable, but it's a really important thing that a lot of other industries have done well in years past. Montana.
Yeah, I was just going to add, that expression, culture each strategy for breakfast. I think we need to be thinking about the culture we're trying to influence and frankly create. And we're up against a really intense, deep-seated fear when it's fear of change. And it's really hard to overcome. So I think the more we can think about how we build those relationships in place, and when we build them successfully in place and a project gets approved and goes through, like that's not the end of the story. That's the beginning of the story for the community. And that's the beginning of how we actually change the culture in a way that's tangible and makes sense. So that is a data point for us to think about and use in how we create the next project that can go through, by sharing those stories, having those people who are now seeing tangible benefits and have overcome that fear of change because things are now different in the community and it's okay. How can we have them tell those stories in an organic way to help that ripple effect continue, or potentially continue? So I think, yeah, not treating projects as like one-offs, but thinking about them as like a thread in storytelling and relationship building across the country is probably a different way we need to look at it.
Absolutely. That's make a huge impact. And those stories we found to be some of the most powerful messages that we can share, the success stories and proof that many of the facts and figures and opportunities that we're sharing have materialized in a real way for folks. It makes a big difference. So I've got one question for the group as a whole before we turn it over to Q&A from the audience. We've had a lot trickling in, so excited to get to some of those. But we've talked a lot about strategy over the last 40 minutes and understanding that there really is no replacement for being there and doing the hard work, but curious about some of the tactics that you found, whether it's bleeding edge campaigns that you've run locally or things that you just have found work. So the tactics that inform that strategy, what is working for all of you, and what are some things that you'd be interested in trying?
So I meant to share this on the first question that you asked me, Bradley, but about regulatory engagement. And I really think the answer to this one is about going above and beyond the Call of Duty. I do think there's a number of boxes to check in this space, but I do think there's a number of boxes that are not checked. We here at Steelhead try to check those boxes that are not checked by reaching out to different organizations, different stakeholders. We recently went down the path of standing up a community benefits framework that we can use in local communities to help communities actually kind of direct the development and the siting of our projects so they can have more stake in feeling like they're a part of this effort. And so that's, I've got a couple examples that I can share, but if anybody wants to reach out afterwards about specific examples, I don't want to give away too much here, but I do think it's about going above and beyond and trying to reach out to organizations and groups that you don't typically look for. But I am interested in Bevan's thoughts on this one.
Absolutely.
So I would just say in terms of sort of bleeding edge tactics, I'm really excited about the work that Montana is doing, the deep canvassing work. I think there's a lot of potential there. I think it's a really big investment. But again, I think companies need to invest more in this space across the board. And given the size and scale of a lot of the projects being built, I think those investments are obviously well worth it. When it comes down, the beyond box checking, I think, again, I mean, going back to the general theme, one thing, the way to look at this is to reflect back on, let's say you've gone through the development process on a project, reflect on how many strong relationships you've actually been able to build in that community. How many people, if you were going to be doing a site trip, could you call up and, meet up for dinner or, a cup of coffee or something like that, or just swing by and say hello? The most successful projects that I've been on are the ones where a developer, the community engagement lead, walks into a restaurant and people go up and start to say hello because they've been there so much. Everybody recognizes them and they know them so well, and they've been able to build those really strong relationships. And I think tactically, again, another important one is to invest in these communities. I think long-term CBAs are really, I think the verdict's still out in terms of the data, but I think generally they're a really good mechanism for showing communities a real commitment to going above and beyond. But, it's just looking for those opportunities for smaller donations and sponsorships all the way throughout the development life cycle. And, again, it's not just cutting those checks, but it's actually showing up to the dinners and the fundraisers and the events that you're actually sponsoring is super important. So it goes back to just spending that time. And I will just give a quick little plug. All of this again sort of sounds a little bit squishy and relationships and time. But one thing that I think is super important and a little bit in the weeds is you can't measure the things that you don't track. And I think, setting up stakeholder trackers. So, it could be as simple as a spreadsheet. I think in an ideal world, it would be a stakeholder management platform, a CRM. But, companies that want to do this right need to actually start to create the systems and processes to do this efficiently. And, again, with the development cycle being, several years long, you might have people roll off of a project, or you might forget what you did 2-3 years ago when the project was first getting started. So setting up those systems to track stakeholders, the contacts and the relationships, to keep notes on all of those folks and then enable more efficient communications with them, I think are super important.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think from like a strategy perspective, you have different strategies you're hitting on. You're doing your government relations and you're getting your intel and you're feeding it into the other strategies of engaging with those grass tops community leaders. Again, getting intel, feeding that in, building relationships, building trust. You're doing your communications work to reinforce the messages that you're hearing in the community that are working, and helping display the like self-interest of the community to more people than you can reach. And then there's the grassroots piece, which is kind of my wheelhouse. And so in the grassroots piece, I think there's a couple of streams to follow. One is you're finding your existing supporters, you're IDing them, and you're doing that through things like going to community events from a tactic perspective, and you're canvassing at the community events, which just means having conversations with people and trying to collect those people in some way to your cause. You can also like stand on the street corner and talk to people. You can go hold court in the local diner. Um, and when you collect all those supporters, then you're trying to bring them together and give them a home and get them connected to each other and not just to you, so they can figure out how to take action together beyond just like a specific moment and be a team and, some champions that are built organically around renewable energy. And that's just like good old-fashioned community organizing theory. It's been researched, it works. And then I think you want to think tactically about your undecided and opposed residents. And they're like, if there's only a few of them, maybe you don't need to do anything. Maybe you can just let that go and focus on your supporters. But if you feel like you do need to do something about them, this is where you could look at something like deep canvassing as a tactic and think about, do I need to change their hearts and minds and apply this in a door-to-door or phone methodology? And then if you do, and then they become supporters, then you can organize those supporters into your community organizing cycle.
And I'll just say, I think the main takeaway from this whole segment, Brad, is that there's no silver bullet to any of this. I think you heard from Bevan, showing up, trust. You heard from me, CBAs going above and beyond, and you heard from Montana some specific strategies to deploy. But I think the name of the game with this is that there's nothing any of the three of us can say where it's like this is going to have 100% hit rate. You kind of have to do all of these different things, which plays into the time, the relationship aspect, the trust side of things, which makes this an incredibly fun space to be in, I would say.
Absolutely. And the first audience question that I want to address follows in the same vein here. So curious, I think specifically Montana, but also really want to hear from Jackson and Bevan on this one. And that's the theory of change around engaging existing and known supporters, folks that we perceive to be agnostic about the project, and then the folks that we know are opposed, whether it's organized or not. And one of the themes being that we've got limited time and resources here. And so time probably being the most valuable resource that we have. Is it worthwhile to engage the folks that we know are staunchly opposed to these projects? And if it is, how?
Well, I think you need to get enough intel so you have a good picture of what's going on in the community and like try to be able to put some percentages or numbers to it, like how many people are actually opposed. Because sometimes four loud voices can make it feel way bigger than it actually is. So I would always think about trying to understand your support base first and find them and bring them together in relationship together and help them show that support at different key times. That's like low-hanging fruit, best, and it's hard. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's easier to get your supporters to do the thing than to totally change someone's mind. If you do feel like you need to deal with the opposition or undecided and activate the undecided towards being supportive or neutralize the opposition, I mean, deep canvassing, that is literally what it's for. It's the best bang for your buck. The change lasts at least 9 months, maybe longer, as shown by the research. So it's the most effective and durable form of persuasion. But yeah, it's intensive to do, but it works.
Jackson, Bevan, thoughts?
Um, I think this one's interesting because I don't like using terminology like neutralize or figure out how to defeat or whatever. I think a lot of these concerns, by and large, do have merit. And I think one of the things that we've tried to do is answer these questions in a way that's public. We had a forum earlier this year where we brought our developer and a couple subject matter experts out and had a 2 hour session where we just rapid fire answered every question the community had. So there's that theory of trying to attack this head on and creating a story that, we're answering questions, we're showing up, we're doing some of the things that Bevan's talking about as well. But there is a handful of things that the opposition throws at us that are just not rooted in anything. And I think we're starting to see a shift in the culture here where we believe it's important to call that out as incorrect. And so there's a question in the Q&A here about, addressing myths. I think it might be this one that we're on, but there's some really good interviews that we could share after the fact here too, which is just calling that out as just not true. And we've gotten into this space as a society where that's becoming more popular to do. And I don't think it comes off as condescending to just say, hey, that's flat out incorrect. But it is important on your trust building journey to address some of the questions that do have merit. And I don't think pushing those off to the side does us any good.
Yeah. Second Jackson's comments, I think, it's the case by case. I don't think you always need to directly engage opposition, especially if it really feels like some of it's not always in the best of faith. But that said, I mean, I think one way to kind of consider how you approach opposition is at the end of the day, you need votes to approve your project. And so, how do I think you can kind of adjust your approach to folks that are asking a lot of difficult questions or being particularly challenging on a project, and sort of engage them as much as you feel like is necessary in order to help address some of the concerns that maybe the county commissioners or decision makers on a project might have.
Got a hand, Montana?
Yeah, I was just going to say,
Yeah.
everything you said for sure, Jackson, true. And I think you can only address the things that aren't true and have anyone even consider hearing if they already trust you. So there has to be, again, that relationship, trust building piece first. And you have to figure out how to do that in a way that works in the community.
One thing I've learned from Montana over the last almost year of working together is that you constantly got to be asking the why and getting to the root of some of these concerns that we see locally. And how much do you think that some of these concerns that folks are having, particularly as we look at rural conservative communities, is about the project itself or the technology itself, and more about the feeling that they are maybe overlooked or they have not been as politically empowered? And this is one way that they can feel like they can take power in their community and oppose something, as opposed to feeling again like they didn't have a voice at the table. So maybe our last question, but perhaps a big one. Wants to jump at that. Might have to call out Jackson just to be difficult.
So I think that there's some merit with this, and I think the question is actually, do these communities find themselves opposing clean energy projects because they don't feel like they have a stake in the federal process? Is that right?
Not on energy specifically, but sort of a stake in the broader political reality that we're living in.
I don't know how true that is. I don't know what's driving a lot of this opposition, especially for, a handful of folks that are vehemently opposed to these projects. I think some of it is, the bigger landowners are signing up, and I think there's some aspect of the community that thinks about that. And I do think that they see these projects as a change to their community. But I think that there's ways that you can address that, right? I mean, going back to the local liaison piece and trying to work with somebody who understands the community and understands their way of life is extremely, extremely important for the development work that we're trying to do here with wind projects in particular. And I think the same is probably true across BESS and solar as well. But I took the first stab at that, interested to see what my fellow participants think.
I do think that some of the backlash, again, I don't know how much you could say like in terms of correlation, but I do think that there's this general frustration in a lot of the communities that were developing projects in feeling a little bit helpless with the direction that things are moving in the country. There was some interesting polling in the last year that, found that in a lot of these communities, especially with, farming operations getting bigger and consolidating, a relatively small percentage of folks within the communities directly worked in agriculture, but an overwhelming majority identified strongly with with their agricultural community. And so, this idea of trying to, wanting to hold on to a lot of the traditions and, frankly, not see this massive change that they feel helpless to, control and stop, I think it is a motivator and a driver to, some of the concern around a lot of these projects. So, again, I don't have, solid data to necessarily point to, but I think it's definitely a factor.
Well, the door knocking and phone calling we've done over the last couple of years, the two kind of key things that come up over and over for residents in these communities is they don't like the looks of them, or they don't think they're going to like the looks of them, or they've seen them somewhere else. They're like, I don't want that here. And they're worried about farmland not being farmable anymore. So I think those two things need to be addressed. And so kind of what you just said about like the potential to still farm, they need to like understand that's possible. They need to understand the landowners, especially if they're smaller landowners, they want this. And in terms of like the piece, they don't like the looks of them. Like there's not, there's some things you can do with landscaping, of course. And also like it is going to change the landscape. And that's again, like this fear of change and a fear of things being different. So we have to kind of help them come to terms with that, I think. Yeah, all kind of deep things to think about and to figure out how to help people through. And it's not easy, but it isn't that hard either. But you do need to have trust with them to be able to do that.
And on that point, Brett, I think it's important to say we shouldn't accept the premise that they are ugly, right? There's a lot of this out there. Oh, I don't want to look at them because they're ugly. We, as developers, shouldn't accept the premise that what we're building is ugly, and we should be doing everything we can to make it a great project that we're extremely proud of. And that should come out in our confidence and our pitch to the community through some of this trust building exercise that we're really proud of this, and you should be too.
On that note, I'm thinking about a trip a few years ago where we did some testimonial videos in Illinois and filmed some neighbors who thought that the wind turbines were beautiful. And so there are those other perspectives. I just don't think that they're shared, and I won't go off on that whole tangent, but I do think there's opportunity to sort of tell that story about how graceful and beautiful some people see this infrastructure, especially when you think about, one wind turbine powering, 1,000+ homes as it slowly spins across the landscape. I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I love that perspective. I think that's really important. So change, yes, but I think it's up to us to make the case that it isn't an ugly piece of infrastructure, that it is beautiful. But noticing here that we are somehow already getting to the top of the hour, wanted to say thank you again to Bevan, Montana, and Jackson, and everybody who has attended over the last hour with us. But seeing as there were a lot of Q&A that we weren't able to get to, want to make sure that folks know how to get in touch with our panelists to ask them any of these questions or just to get in touch generally. So quickly, if we want to just go around and just share the best way to find you or your organization and how to get in touch. Kick it off with you, Montana.
Yeah, you can find me on my website, mountaintopstrategies.org, or on LinkedIn. My name is Montana Burgess.
Bevan?
Yeah, I'd say easiest way to find me is probably on LinkedIn, Bevan Augustine. Bradley, I'd also be happy to share my contact information if you want to send it around with a recording or whatever.
Absolutely. And Jackson?
Same is true for me.
Awesome. And you can find the Conservative Energy Network at conservativeenergynetwork.org and Land and Liberty Coalition at landandlibertycoalition.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, and to make it clear, I know we saw a question on this. Everybody who registered and attended will get a copy of this recording sent to them in their email. So again, thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and a wonderful holiday season. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.